Welcome to Compact Biographies from compactbiographies.com, where we tell you interesting things about interesting people in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 238, Captain Kidd. William Kidd was born into a world where the sea offered opportunity and danger in equal measure. By the time he entered public record, England's expanding empire relied heavily on men like him, captains authorised to use violence at sea in the service of trade and crown. The title mattered. A privateer acted legally under commission. A pirate did not. Kidd's life would be consumed by the space between those two words. In 1695, Kidd received a privateering commission signed in London, authorising him to hunt pirates and enemy shipping in the Indian Ocean. The mission was backed by influential political figures, and Kidd was not sent out as a criminal but as an instrument of order, tasked with suppressing piracy while enriching his investors through lawful prize-taking. The problem was that maritime law at the end of the 17th century was precise on paper and dangerously vague at sea, determining whether a ship was an enemy, a pirate, or a legitimate merchant could depend on flags flown, papers carried, or alliances claimed under duress. Decisions had to be made quickly, often thousands of miles from any court that might later judge them. Kidd sailed aboard the Adventure Galley, a vessel armed with 34 guns and powered by both sail and oar. His instructions were clear in theory, but fraught in practice. Any misstep could turn a lawful seizure into an act of piracy. When Kidd later insisted that he had acted within his commission, he was arguing not only for his own innocence, but for the legitimacy of privateering itself. When his enemies called him a pirate, they were drawing a line that protected political patrons ashore while condemning the man who carried out their risky work. From the beginning, Kidd's story was less about simple criminality and more about how easily legality could collapse once the horizon disappeared. William Kidd emerged from the maritime culture of 17th century Scotland, a society where seafaring offered one of the few paths to advancement for men without land or title. Born in Dundee around 1645, Kidd grew up in a port town shaped by shipbuilding, coastal trade, and the constant movement of sailors, merchants, and naval crews. Dundee's economy depended on the sea, and for young men of ambition, ships offered escape from poverty as well as the promise of profit. By the 1670s, Kidd had moved into the wider Atlantic world, a violent and opportunistic arena linking Europe, the Caribbean, North America, and Africa. This was not a romantic frontier, but a harsh commercial system built on war, slavery, and imperial rivalry. England, the Netherlands, France, and Spain competed aggressively for trade routes and colonies, and maritime violence was not an aberration, but a tool of policy. Kidd first appears clearly in colonial records in the Caribbean during the early 1680s. On the 9th of August, 1689, he was appointed captain of the Blessed William, a privateering vessel operating during King William's War, the conflict between England and France that followed the Glorious Revolution. His commission authorised him to attack French shipping in the West Indies, and contemporary accounts suggest he carried out these duties competently. By the early 1690s, Kidd had settled in New York, then a growing colonial port city heavily entangled in Atlantic trade and smuggling. He married Sarah Bradley Cox Ort on the 16th of May, 1691, a wealthy widow whose property and connections elevated his social standing considerably. The marriage placed Kidd among New York's merchant elite and brought him into close contact with men who profited from maritime commerce, both legal and illicit. Kidd's reputation in New York was not that of a pirate, but of a successful sea captain with political and commercial ties. He moved comfortably among colonial officials and merchants, attended civic functions, and presented himself as a respectable figure. This respectability mattered. Privateering relied on trust. Investors needed captains who could command crews, manage prizes, and navigate complex legal claims without jeopardizing profit. Yet the Atlantic world in which Kidd operated was morally unstable. The line between privateer and pirate shifted depending on war, peace, paperwork, and politics. A man who seized enemy ships during wartime could be celebrated as a patriot, then prosecuted as a criminal once alliances changed. Kidd's career advanced precisely because he understood this system and believed he could navigate it successfully. By the mid-1690s, with England seeking to suppress piracy while quietly benefiting from its profits, Kidd appeared an ideal candidate for a dangerous experiment. He was experienced, well-connected, and accustomed to operating in legal grey zones. His rise from a Scottish port town to the heart of England's Atlantic Empire was not accidental. It was the product of ambition, skill, and a willingness to work within a system that rewarded risk but offered little protection when things went wrong. William Kidd's most consequential commission was conceived in London in late 1695, at a moment when England faced an embarrassing contradiction. Piracy was disrupting trade across the Indian Ocean, yet many colonial officials quietly tolerated pirates because they brought wealth into port cities. Publicly, the Crown wanted piracy crushed. Privately, it wanted the profits to keep flowing. Kidd was selected to operate inside that contradiction. On the 11th of December 1695, a formal commission was issued authorising Kidd to seize pirate vessels and attack French shipping, England being at war with France. A second document, the Royal Letters Patent, laid out the financial structure of the venture, naming prominent investors who would receive shares of any prizes taken. Among them was Richard Coote, Earl of Bellamont, who would later become Governor of New York. These were not shadowy backers, they were pillars of the political establishment. Kidd was given command of the Adventure Galley, a newly built ship launched at Deptford earlier that year. It was an unusual hybrid, equipped with sails for long voyages and oars for manoeuvring in calm or confined waters. Armed with 34 guns and crewed by roughly 150 men, it was designed to chase pirates who relied on speed and shallow harbours. On paper, it was ideally suited to its mission. Kidd sailed from Deptford on the 6th of September 1696. Almost immediately, the practical problems of his commission became clear. His crew expected profit, not police work. Pirate hunters were paid only if they captured pirates, and pirates were elusive. French merchant ships were easier targets, but identifying them depended on papers that could be forged, flags that could be changed, and testimony that might later be disputed. Each decision at sea carried legal risk. The ambiguity extended to geography. Kidd was authorised to operate in the Indian Ocean, a vast space thousands of miles from England's courts. Communication with London took months. By the time a legal judgment could be rendered, the circumstances that produced it were long past. Kidd was expected to make split-second decisions that would later be judged with hindsight by men who had never left dry land. Even the definition of piracy was unstable. Some captains held commissions from foreign powers that England did not recognise. Others claimed to have been forced into service by pirates. A seizure that seemed justified in the moment could later be reclassified as criminal if political winds shifted. Kidd understood these risks, but he also believed his commission and connections would protect him. This belief was central to his downfall. The mission was framed as lawful and honourable, but it was structured in a way that transferred risk downward. Success would enrich investors and enhance reputations. Failure would be borne by the man at sea. From the moment Kidd left the Thames, the margin for error was vanishingly small. The commission promised legitimacy, but it offered little shelter once events began to slip beyond control. William Kidd's expedition began to unravel not with a single dramatic act, but through a series of pressures that accumulated over months at sea. By early 1697, the Adventure Galley had reached the Indian Ocean after a punishing voyage marked by disease, desertion, and dwindling morale. Crewmen grew restless. Many had signed on expecting swift prizes, not long chases and empty horizons. Kidd's authority, though still intact, was under constant strain. Tensions came to a head on the 30th of October, 1697, during an altercation aboard the ship off the coast of India. Kidd struck his gunner, William Moore, with a bucket during a heated argument about whether to attack a passing vessel. Moore died the following day from his injuries. The incident was later seized upon as evidence of Kidd's brutality, but at the time it was treated as a disciplinary matter at sea, harsh but not unprecedented. Still, it marked a turning point. Kidd had crossed a moral and legal threshold that would follow him to the gallows. The expedition's most consequential act occurred on the 30th of January 1698 with the seizure of the Quedar Merchant, a large Armenian-owned trading ship sailing under French passes. The vessel carried an immensely valuable cargo of silk, satin, sugar, and gold. Kidd believed the French papers made the ship a legitimate prize under his commission. Many of his crew agreed, seeing in it the reward they had long been promised. Yet the seizure was dangerously ambiguous. Although the Quedar Merchant carried French documentation, its ownership was complex, involving merchants from Mughal India and other non-French interests. This distinction would later be used to argue that Kidd had attacked a lawful, neutral ship. At the time, however, Kidd faced an immediate choice: refuse the prize and risk mutiny, or take it and hope legality would follow profit. He chose the latter. After the capture, discipline eroded further. Kidd's crew pressured him to abandon the adventure galley, which was by then leaking badly. In April 1698, the ship was deliberately run aground and burned off the coast of Madagascar. Kidd transferred to the captured vessel, now renamed the Adventure Prize, a decision that would later be portrayed as evidence of criminal intent. By this point, rumours of piracy were spreading faster than Kidd could outrun them. Former crewmen deserted and began telling their own versions of events. Some sought amnesty by denouncing their captain. Others simply disappeared into pirate settlements, carrying stories that grew darker with each retelling. Kidd still believed his commission would shield him. He continued to insist that his actions were lawful, that the French passes justified the seizures, and that any violence aboard ship had been necessary to maintain order. But the line between privateering and piracy had already been crossed, not only by Kidd's actions, but by the shifting political needs of those who had sent him. What had once been a sanctioned mission was becoming a liability, and Kidd was about to learn how quickly a useful agent could be recast as a criminal example. William Kidd returned to the Atlantic world in 1699, believing fatally that his political patrons would still protect him. By then, reports of piracy in the Indian Ocean had reached London, and the mood had shifted sharply. England was eager to demonstrate that it took piracy seriously, particularly to reassure powerful trading interests. Kidd, once useful, had become inconvenient. In July 1699, Kidd sailed into the Caribbean and learned that he had been proclaimed a pirate. The news was devastating. He attempted to salvage his situation by travelling to New York, trusting in his relationship with the Earl of Bellamont, who had become royal governor. On the 6th of July 1699, Kidd arrived in Boston, having been lured there under the promise of a fair hearing. Instead, Bellamont ordered his arrest almost immediately. Kidd was imprisoned, first in Boston and later transferred to England in April 1700. His trial took place at the Old Bailey in London on the 8th and 9th of May 1701. The proceedings were deeply flawed even by the standards of the time. Kidd was denied legal counsel and forced to represent himself against experienced prosecutors. Crucially, the French passes taken from the Quedar Merchant, which Kidd believed would prove his innocence, were not produced in court. Whether this omission was deliberate or negligent remains debated, but its effect was decisive. Without them, Kidd's claim that he had acted lawfully collapsed. The prosecution portrayed Kidd as a pirate from the outset, presenting witness testimony from former crew members who had every incentive to shift blame. The killing of William Moore was emphasised as evidence of a violent character rather than contextualized as shipboard discipline. Kidd attempted to explain himself, but his arguments were technical, legalistic, and poorly received by a court already inclined to convict. On the 23rd of May, 1701, Kidd was found guilty of murder and 5 counts of piracy. He was sentenced to death. He was taken to Execution Dock at Wapping and hanged. The execution itself became part of the spectacle. The rope broke on the first attempt, forcing a second hanging, a grim detail that fed public fascination. After his death, Kidd's body was gibbeted in chains over the River Thames near Tilbury, where it remained for years as a warning to sailors entering London. The message was clear. The state would tolerate private violence only so long as it remained useful. Once it threatened political order, the same violence would be publicly condemned. Kidd died insisting that he was no pirate. History would spend centuries arguing over whether he was right or whether the system that empowered him had simply decided to sacrifice him when it no longer needed his services. William Kidd did not disappear with his execution. In many ways, his story only began to grow after his death. Almost immediately, rumours circulated that Kidd had hidden vast quantities of treasure before his arrest. These stories were fueled by a real event. In June 1699, while seeking to negotiate his return, Kidd buried a small cache of goods on Gardiner's Island, off Long Island, intending it as leverage with authorities. The recovered items were modest, but the idea took hold. As the early 18th century progressed, Kidd became a symbol rather than a man. Ballads, pamphlets, and later novels transformed him into a classic pirate figure, complete with buried gold and secret maps. These stories ignored the legal complexities of his commission and simplified his career into a moral fable. Kidd became the warning example used to demonstrate the consequences of maritime crime, which was convenient because he could no longer defend himself. The British state benefited from this transformation. Casting Kidd as a villain helped distance political elites from the privateering system that had enabled him. It suggested that piracy was the result of individual greed rather than structural ambiguity. Over time, nuance vanished, replaced by legend. Today, Kidd occupies a strange space between history and myth. He was neither the romantic pirate of popular culture nor an entirely innocent man. He was a product of an empire that outsourced violence and then punished those who carried it out. His legacy endures not because of treasure, but because his life exposes how easily legality can shift and how quickly a useful agent can become a convenient villain. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Biographies, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactbiographies.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering history, warfare, disasters, mysteries, and true crime. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/biographiescoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.